Only recently, in the months since Nate started soliciting papers for the Symposium, has Apple TV Plus become the undisputed leader in televisual sci-fi. A position heralded by a series of think pieces this summer and solidified by surging viewership this fall for two continuing series, Invasion and Foundation, that were drafting off the launch of two bona fide hits, Severance and Silo. But the truth is, Apple TV Plus has been disproportionately invested in sci-fi since its launch in November of 2019. Two of the four series in its inaugural slate were elaborate sci-fi serials, and both ran for 3 seasons or more, despite high production costs and lackluster ratings. The former, that is For All Mankind, remains in active production, scheduled to premiere its 4th season next month. This patience has become characteristic of Apple's relationship to sci-fi offerings. They return to the well over and over again, both renewing middling shows and greenlighting new series, despite the overall weak performance of their offerings in this genre, at least until recently. Such strategic decisions contradict the conventional wisdom deployed by Apple TV Plus's ostensible adversaries in the streaming wars, which have grown increasingly cutthroat post-lockdown, as nobody, Apple included, is making much money despite lavish investments in building their content archives. As one tech reporter put it, Apple's persistence with aspirational technology has carried over to its programming of sci-fi on its streaming service. I think the aesthetic and ideological alliances between Apple and contemporary sci-fi are real and demand parsing, more extensively even than I can promise to do with this paper. But any critique of Apple TV Plus content has to start by acknowledging that it is not being produced under the same constraints or with the same ambitions historically associated with televisual sci-fi, even televisual sci-fi in the streaming era. Unlike any of their ostensible competitors, I believe Apple regards its streaming service, as I do, as an advertising firm. In real dollars, this in-house advertising firm is exorbitantly expensive. Apple TV Plus is spending around $3 billion a year, and according to the most generous estimates, probably recouping no more than half of that from subscription fees. But if we think of Apple TV Plus not according to the standards that govern the rest of the streaming sector, but rather as part of an advertising budget, those costs are actually fairly negligible. Even if Apple TV Plus only recoups 1/3 of what it spends, that net loss probably amounts to barely 0.5% of the company's annual revenue. Even if you combine Apple TV Plus with Apple's traditional advertising expenditures, the total is somewhere between 3 and 5% of revenue, at a time when it is common for multinational corporations to spend 10% or more. You'll notice I'm being a little imprecise here, using words like probably and likely. That's because Apple, unlike the other conglomerates with streaming services, does not report Apple TV Plus revenue in isolation, but lumps it into a services category, which is an enormous spit bucket of its most profitable and most underperforming products. Apple gets away with this because, unlike all those other conglomerates, Apple shareholders mainly care about net profits and iPhone sales. So what accounting details we do have about Apple TV Plus come from either vague answers to questions or third-party approximations. This accounting practice, I think, even by itself, tells you a lot about the idiosyncrasy of Apple's approach to streaming. An approach which I believe makes Apple the corporate author par excellence, in the tradition developed by scholars like Jerome Christensen and Michael Zalé, who have argued that the Hollywood studios and cable networks that Hollywood studios and cable networks should occupy the auteur position rather than a director, screenwriter, or showrunner in discussions of cinematic or televisual texts. While this model remains mildly controversial in film and media studies, it would seem pretty standard to claim that advertising is corporately authored. And just to further reinforce this point, that Apple TV Plus programming is advertising, I would point to the saturation and intentionality of product placements. A Wall Street Journal deep dive found more than 250 shots of Apple products in one season of the morning show, and more than 1.24 shots per minute in a single episode of Ted Lasso. Moreover, there are strict platform-wide rules about product placement, including forbidding any character who has been categorized as a villain from being shown using an iPhone. Yeah, you will now be unable to watch any kind of mystery on this platform without paying attention to the phones. So sorry about that, yeah. In a revealing interview with Zalé in Los Angeles Review of Books, the South Korean director Kim Ji-woon, whose series Dr. Brain airs on Apple TV Plus, describes Apple as a corporation that meddles. Ji-woon testifies that Apple's willingness to bankroll expensive techniques, or testifies to Apple's willingness to bankroll expensive techniques without micromanaging the budget, but they micromanage everything else, delivering detailed, accurate, and meticulous notes at every stage of development. These notes come to directors and showrunners through a series of intermediaries and are bureaucratically formatted to disguise the identities of the individuals participating in the ongoing, intensive, and sometimes invasive editorial process. It's like receiving a missive from Big Brother. While there are avenues for the creatives to respond, dispute, and resist the recommendations made in these notes, the whole process is designed to reinforce that the brand who makes the ubiquitous video editing software Final Cut has, well, Final Cut. Apple, more than any other studio, puts the authoritarian in auteur. So what does that mean for televisual sci-fi, including adapted franchises like Isaac Asimov's The Foundation, and shows with celebrated production teams like Extrapolations? Like all advertising, I believe these shows contain overt rhetorical and ideological designs which bolster the corporation's brand, its mission, and its vested interests, but are also infused with the subliminal and the subtextual, and that via cultural critique, we can, at least partially, unveil institutional memory, company culture, repressions and suppressions, collective fears and paranoias, which do not appear in Apple's public filings or the vaunted presentations to stakeholders. Something else that has happened in just the months since we began organizing this symposium, both Apple and Google have crossed the benchmark of 1 billion subscribers to their cloud services. Given that many households share accounts, Apple, in fact, provides discounted rates for family accounts, it seems likely that somewhere between 15 and 25% of the world's population is currently storing something on one or both of these companies' servers. That proportion increases dramatically in the global north. Somewhere between half and 2/3 of all Americans have an iCloud account, though it's hard to know how many of those are free and inactive or, Something else, unlike Apple TV Plus, the margins for cloud services are extremely favorable to Apple's bottom line. As much as 70% of revenue is pure profit for some cloud products. In the most recent fiscal year, Apple services, remember this is the spit bucket I mentioned earlier, accounted for $79 billion of Apple's revenue, more than Macintosh computers, more than iPads, more than earbuds, more than Apple Watches, more than the combined revenues of McDonald's and Nike combined. Apple services, again, this is their most profitable and their least profitable things all lumped together in one category. Apple services revenue trails only iPhones as a category on Apple's balance sheet. Apple CEO Tim Cook loves to talk about the ecosystem, the seamless integration of hardware, software, and cloud services, which incentivizes phone, tablet, and computer owners to purchase additional Apple products, many of which are high-margin subscriptions, which they are likely to retain for their lifetimes, because they are necessary to access things like family photos, personal music libraries, and to back up creative projects. In recent years, Apple innovations have often been designed around surreptitiously gouging cloud subscribers, helplessly fenced into this ecosystem. Take, for instance, the iPhone 15, released last month, which doubles the resolution of photos, even though the change is barely perceptible to the human eye. And by doing so, increases the storage required for an average snapshot by 60%. Simultaneously, Apple is rolling out pricier tiers of cloud storage to accommodate anticipated demand for consumer AI, VR, and 3D. The plan for ongoing growth at Apple revolves around siloing an ever-growing proportion of what humanity uploads for safekeeping. In Understanding Media, Marshall McLuhan claims that since electricity, inventories have been made up not so much of goods in storage as of materials in continuous process of transformation. Following McLuhan, media studies scholarship tends to focus on circulation, interface, commodification, monetization, consumption, and reception. The storage function receives relatively little comment, except to acknowledge that one of the challenges of migrating from one medium to another is the loss or corruption of data. Even this is treated as a kind of inevitability of communication itself over time, compensated for by the continuously increasing speed and scale of communication networks since the Renaissance, such that whatever information might be lost during technological revolutions is dwarfed by that which is gained in aggregate by expanding and accelerating the flows which are simultaneously the system's storage capacity. In the anthropomorphic parlance popularized by computer scientists during the Second World War, not storage, but memory. Though any repository of information, from photo albums to classified military communiques, when migrating from one medium to another will inevitably be altered by the process, media theorists do not regard this as degrading necessarily, because improvements in terms of access and integration with other repositories makes up for whatever risks are associated with the migration. McLuhanian theory presumes a proliferation of interlocking media architectures in which the corruption or collapse of any single repository, the desolation of the BBC archives during World War I, for instance, barely registers in terms of the overall integrity of the system. But what happens if these media architectures become less interlocking, less frequently integrated, more proprietary, and also unfathomably large? I believe the ghost in the machine animating all Apple TV Plus's original programming is the fear from within Apple that it may not be able to accommodate the world's demand for cloud storage, that pressures put upon this untested infrastructure in order to protect Apple's brand equity and shareholder value, combined with the oligopolization of memory across a handful of private tech companies, will precipitate a catastrophic event, one which is hard for us to even think through because there is so little precedent for it. A cloud crash. Hundreds of millions of people lose all their accumulated data all at once. This angst is distributed across the whole platform, from their psychoanalytic sitcom Shrinking to the newsroom soap opera The Morning Show, but it is closest to the surface in Apple's sci-fi catalog. Those of you who have watched Severance or The Foundation will have little trouble imagining how those shows allegorize collective memory, which is counterintuitively totalizing, but also brittle. But nowhere is this angst more palpable than in Apple TV Plus's most recent hit, Silo, based on the self-published short story Wool by Hugh Howey. Silo is named after the 144-floor cylindrical subterranean structure in which the story takes place, sealed off from the surface of a planet rendered uninhabitable by some unremembered cataclysm. Humanity has survived in the silo for centuries, and in the process has lost all substantive documentation of how they got there. History has been reduced to rumors, mantras, and relics, the latter of which are both extremely valuable and extremely taboo. The most contested of the relics featured in the show's first season is a hard disk drive, which predates the rebellion which allegedly destroyed much of the silo's computing capacity 144 years before the action depicted in the series. This drive, which passes through the hands of several of the main characters, closely resembles the HD-20, the first drive Apple manufactured for its personal computing line, Macintosh, specifically the Macintosh 512K, which looks an awful lot like this. The show's Book of Genesis-themed opening credit sequence, complete with a falling apple, reinforces Silo's dominant conceit as the diagrammatic structure morphs into various symbols of networking, coding, and containment. The double helix, the human spine, the seashell, the root system from the tree of knowledge, and the earliest memory drives, which were all drum, cylinder, and funnel shaped, eventually involving plates and disks, mimicking the floor structure of the silo. And then, before the shift to microchip storage, cylinder memory added inward-facing cells, such that the final generation of cylindrical memory drives, like the silo itself, closely resemble Bentham's Panopticon. The first season of Silo follows the Foucauldian reading of the Panopticon, as a series of characters are driven mad, seeking the irretrievable past, and eventually choose ritual suicide / public execution, which in the world of Silo involves simply saying, "I want to go outside." There are many disincentives to leaving the silo, the closed ecosystem, the walled garden. The silo's indoor orchard is literally fertilized by the corpses of its political elites. Just as there are many distinct disincentives to leaving Apple's product line. But there is also an undeniable manic urge to leave, even if only for a few minutes before death, to escape the oppressive claustrophobia of isolationism and collective memory loss, of fealty to power which can offer no plausible record of its own origin. Lost, suppressed, or secret history, of course, is not an entirely unusual motive force for speculative fiction narratives. In fact, Mark Twain authored a secret history eerily similar to Silo in premise, though not in form. Twain's Secret History of Eddypus, the World Empire, is a purposely incomplete, multivocal, miscellany narrative which Twain himself described as distorted, a little out of focus, a trifle out of focus, and recognizably drunk. The secret history unfolds across a collection of letters and partial manuscripts, some of which trace the failed attempts by Mark Twain, Bishop of New Jersey, and a small sect of his subversive disciples to create and preserve their account of how Mary Baker Eddy, founder of the Church of Christ Scientist, captured the infrastructure of Roman Catholicism and the American military to make herself and her matrilineal daughters hereditary popes ruling over Europe, North America, and their colonies. Impeded from absolute global empire only by the unconquerable and enlightened Chinese. China is fetishized in this, as in much of Twain's late writing, as the last best hope for humanity. Like the coven of vain revolutionaries from Silo who call themselves the Flame Keepers, but whose most cherished relic proves to be a brochure from the Chattanooga National Forest, the history that Bishop Twain's disciples managed to pass down is comically inept. I'll give you just a moment to read part of this. It's worth it. It gives Twain occasion to flaunt his burlesque talents, undiminished 35 years after the publication of The Jumping Frog. But despite these characteristic Twainian flourishes, Oedipus is a proto-modernist text, more reminiscent of Gertrude Stein than Twain's self-styled literary disciples like Brander Matthews or Harold Frederick. Twain sacrifices clarity for linguistic play, demonstrates deep engagement with Western history, philosophy, and science by making surrealist pastiche of it, and abandons unreliable narrators even for polyphony and collage. Like much of the writing he did during the final decade of his life, Twain likely never had any plan to publish The Secret History, except as part of the vault of manuscripts he was creating to prolong his copyrights, financially securing his surviving daughters and their unborn children, while also attempting to exert some degree of control over his literary legacy. It is metafictionally appropriate that the secret history of Oedipus' world empire be folded into a large archive of unpublished work. Like the autobiography that is also part of that archive, it reflects the intensity of Twain's thinking about literary celebrity and legacy, biographical and historical criticism, and posthumous transfer of intellectual property. The Mark Twain Project has dated the secret history manuscripts to the first 2 years of the 20th century, although they place Twain's first mention of the premise more than a decade before that. Around the same time, he started meticulously thinking about preserving his own personal archive. This dating is important in my account because one of the few media theorists who departs from McLuhan's account of the automatic storage function of media systems is Friedrich Kittler, who in Discourse Network's 1800-1900 identifies two historical moments when the reliable storage function of the media system is threatened by technological change, the latter of them concurrent with Twain's writing of The Secret History. The emergence of electric media, and I love the passage that Max pulled about electricity and religious empire, right? The emergence of electric media for recording and storing images and sound threatened the hegemony of text as a medium of history which had persisted since Gutenberg. The seemingly inevitable proliferation of telecommunications, analog recordings, and filmic reproductions at the outset of the 20th century posed a risk to historical memory on three vectors. First, the neglect of the print archive, either by incomplete or inadequate migration of its contents into new media, or by divestment in the labor and infrastructure required to preserve it. Second, overconfidence in the superiority and sustainability of new media, such that record-keeping such that the obsolescent media of record might be destroyed before the durability of new media for record-keeping purposes had been proven. And finally, sabotage. Governments, corporations, and other agents who gain disproportionate control over the migration process have the power to alter and erase the record selectively, in accordance with their interests and worldview. And if they succeed in sustaining this corpus, or if they succeed in sustaining this control as the new media infrastructure expands, as new media infrastructures inevitably will, it becomes a more effective tool for imperialism than any weapon or trade route. In Twain's Oedipus, all imperial subjects are required to purchase state media at exorbitant prices. And the Eddy family controls everything that is distributed. Again, the piece about the members of the church having to sell books. Right? Twain is definitely just pulling that into this speculative narrative, extrapolating it into the future. And the Eddy family controls everything that is distributed. Primarily, it is implied in pictorial form. Similarly, in the silo, the IT department claims exclusive control over the media infrastructure, and hacking into it or circulating information via relic technology are capital crimes. Twain had been predicting, since at least the end of the Civil War, that the United States would eventually backslide into monarchy, that human nature could not tolerate democracy for long, no matter how ingeniously the government was designed to prevent the consolidation of power. At the turn of the century, he was able to imagine more precisely how this backsliding might take place, which he describes in numerous places as a return to the Dark Ages. In the Secret History version of this prophecy, he imagines the military imperialism of Roosevelt Republicans uniting with the evangelicalism of the Christian Scientists to administer an emerging system of illiterate media. The authoritarian government force feeds the public a carefully curated historical record and cuts off access to any conflicting or contextualizing accounts. The world empire of Oedipus is a dystopia made possible by destroying print archives like the one Twain himself was urgently creating. Fortunately, a Christian fascist police state takeover of a totalizing media ecosystem for the purpose of gaslighting the populace with fabricated history has become, in the intervening century, an unimaginable absurdity. Right? Thank you.